Womajeka. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're organising this event from the unceded lands of the Kulin and nearby nations. Chris, Michelle, David and myself are on Wurundjeri land, and our speaker Kerry is on Eora Nation land. They've all cared for and managed these lands in a sustainable and responsible manner for many tens of thousands of years. When the initial settlers arrived, the common statement was the land was like a gentleman's park, with the soils so friable, with good grasses up to their saddles, and bulbs being uprooted by the wagon wheels. We have much to learn from them, not only on their land, farming and fire practices, but also in their governance procedures, which have led to no major wars across this continent for tens of thousands of years. We need to respond to their welcome to country by also truly caring for this country. I offer my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to all of their mobs and to people from other mobs attending here today. And to all of you who have logged in from near and far and all over this country. Hi, I'm Rob Gardner and I help organise these events with Chris, Rick, Michelle and Peter. And today my particular thanks to David, who's managing all the activities in the background. Firstly, some housekeeping. Tonight's presentation and Q&A will be recorded and available to be downloaded in the near future from the Melbourne Renew YouTube website. Previous presentations are also on the site and one can be registered to be provided with a link. If you have any technical problems or general comments, please use the chat button on the bottom left of the computer. If you have questions, then use the Q&A button in the bottom center. Keep the questions fairly short if possible. We usually have lots of questions, so we'll try and consolidate similar ones and then cover as many as possible in the time available. As a few may be new to these webinars, Renew was formed in 1980 to promote sustainability in all its forms. It is best known for its two magazines, Renew and Sanctuary, but also for events such as Sustainable House Day and Speed Date and Expert, which were both virtual this year. Also electric vehicle fairs and attending many other fairs and events. However, it has a significant research section and lobbying group, free modelling packages in Sunulator and Tankulator, and also an advisory service aimed not only for households, but is offered to businesses and government. Tonight, we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Kerry Schott AO, the Chair of the Energy Security Board, making a presentation followed by a Q&A session. Kerry is well known to many of you, as she's often been in the news, commenting on climate policies and outcomes, and also presented to us a couple of years ago. Currently, she's also a director of the NBN, and previously she was the MD of Sydney Water and the Deutsche Bank, and Executive Vice President for Bankers Trust. This evening, we have a highly qualified and experienced presenter, so thank you, and over to you, Kerry.
Thanks very much, Rob, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I thought what I'd do tonight was to just run through the main changes that are happening in electricity and some of the issues that we're grappling with and some of the changes that will come over coming years and decades. And as you know, there's two principal things been happening in the electricity market on the ground, as it were, practically. And the first is a large increase in the amount of large-scale renewables entering the market. And the NEM, which is the electricity market for Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, ACT, South Australia and Tassie, is now running on close to 25% large-scale renewables. Some jurisdictions are running on much more than that. South Australia is running fairly consistently at over 50%. And Tasmania, with a lot of hydro and increasing wind, is running at net zero emissions pretty much regularly now. So they're running at 100%. The other states, Victoria and New South Wales in particular, and Queensland, are all catching up very quickly. And the ACT has contracted itself to be 100% renewables. So what we're seeing is all of the states with a decarbonisation target of net zero by 2050, and a lot of schemes in place to help them get there. What all of these renewables coming in means, though, it means that on the good side that decarbonisation is happening, and it also means that the wholesale price is really falling a lot. The drop in the price means that coal is finding it increasingly difficult to run economically. The way that dispatch works, you get dispatched every 5 minutes and half an hour if you're the cheapest in the bid stack. And of course, coal is never going to get beaten by wind and solar, who will bid in at close to zero, and sometimes bid in at less than zero because they're being financed by someone to decarbonise. So coal is finding it increasingly difficult to make money, particularly where their fuel cost is about $50 a megawatt or more, and wind and solar are running on fuel costs of zero. So you can see that the value stack there is really against the coal plants, and they're aging rapidly, and we're anticipating that over the course of the next 2 decades they will go and retire completely, and many will be gone by 2030. So while we're currently running at about 25%, with some states doing more, we'd anticipate that by 2030 we could be running across the whole NEM at close to 50%. And over time, that number could go up to round about 70%. And at the moment, with the technology we've got, it's very difficult to run the system with higher percentages than that all the time. We can run at 100% often, but not regularly. So we've got to do things to make sure that we keep the system reliable, and we've always got enough megawatts even when it's not sunny or windy. And we've also got to make sure that we're running the system to ensure we've got enough system strength and frequency and voltage and inertia. Those things tend to come from hydro and thermal and, well, gas or coal at the moment. Hydrogen, we're anticipating, will play a major role once it's developed further, and whether or not it does get developed further remains to be seen, but it's looking very promising. So that's what's happening in the big picture. The other thing that's happening in the smaller picture is that Australia is leading the world with people putting rooftop solar on their homes and on their business. And we're currently finding that about 5% of the demand in the market is being met by all those small rooftop solar units. And they're having quite an astonishing effect in some of our cities. In Adelaide at the moment, in the middle of the day, there is so much solar being produced from homes and warehouses and the like, that there is no demand for energy on the grid. And the no demand happens quite quickly. So a hot day, about 12 o'clock, suddenly no demand on the distribution network, and it's causing all sorts of stability problems. Similarly, just as you approach 3:30 or 4 o'clock, the solar ramps down, and you can get quite sudden drops in the solar supply on homes, and so then the demand on the grid suddenly goes up. So this volatility is really quite difficult for the distribution companies to manage. And we're looking at ways at which you can manage it and add value to customers. And it's a very exciting and promising area, because we're moving into a situation where people can make money by managing their demand. And it doesn't mean turning off your air conditioning when it's hot. What it does mean is warming your hot water when there's plenty of power around, which is no longer in the middle of the night. It happens to be in the middle of the day. Turning your pool pumps on at that time, and just generally managing appliances in your home to fit the load that you've got. And of course, if you've got a battery inside, or you've got an electric vehicle, or you've got a community battery in your street, you can use the excess power that's being generated in the middle of the day to charge those batteries, and use that power later in the day when there's less solar available. So these are things that are being worked on, and they're quite technically complicated because of the physics and some of the software and dispatch algorithms that are involved. But the other thing that's important is to make sure that we've got the transmission system in place to enable the new generation that's being built to actually come into the system. So there's a major redevelopment of the transmission system underway, in line with an integrated system plan that you've probably heard about. And at the moment, the interconnect between New South Wales and Queensland's being upgraded. South Australia is looking to put in an interconnect with New South Wales, which is going through approval processes. South Australia is putting in synchronous condensers to basically add strength to their grid, because they don't have, they have a bit of gas still running, but they don't have any coal anymore, and they need more strength in their system. And they've also, as you know, put in a big set of batteries to add frequency. And the other transmission that's going on is to do with snowy hydro. So the expansion of snowy hydro that's due to be completed in 2025-26 to back up the renewables. We'll have an additional connection into Victoria and an additional upgrade to their link through to the main load in Sydney. So those things will be the first round of increases in the grid. And as you know, the Tasmanians are very keen to put Marinus Link in across Bass Strait to upgrade and expand their connection into Victoria and the mainland market. So there's a lot of change going on. I'm very happy to take questions about everything, but I thought it's probably better if I just talk for a little while. And those 4 topics are really the main issues: the having enough megawatts in the system, making sure we keep the system secure, integrating rooftop solar, and other distributed energy resources that are around, and by that we mean hot water systems, flow pumps, all manner of appliances like that can be used, and building out the transmission system. So I'll leave it at that, Rob, and happy to take questions.
So our first question is from MacBook Air. How can you have an integrated system without centralized control?
We have got centralized control on the large system, which AEMO controls through a number of mechanisms that it's got, but largely through its dispatch system. And it dispatches power on the basis of bids. It used to be every half an hour, but it's now every 5 minutes. And it dispatches, the other condition of dispatch apart from price is that they have to keep the system stable. So they'll always make sure they've got an appropriate mix of resources to keep that system stable. With the rooftop solar, with the software that's now available, there will need to be some controls over what happens when it's connected into the system, but probably and almost entirely automatic and done through software. So as a last resort, you need the ability to be able to disconnect, say, a whole suburb if they're causing issues for the distribution network. But that is an absolute last resort, and we anticipate that managing load and managing exports of power is probably something that will be done through very smart energy systems, and we can coordinate in that way. So I don't think the software is very complicated. It's just a matter of getting it set up properly.
So you could switch everybody's system, sort of take 20% off what they're sending back to the grid, or?
It's not, the problem is actually not about what people are exporting into the grid, which is quite manageable. The problem is when people stop taking power from the grid, and we have minimum demand, and it happens suddenly. If you can see it coming, it's manageable. But if it suddenly there's things are going along and then there's suddenly cloud cover, or there's suddenly a big burst of export, that's what makes things quite difficult.
And can batteries pick up that?
Batteries, they can, and the batteries can be quite small battery units in homes or EVs, or in Perth they're quite successfully trialling community batteries, so that in a street, if there's a substation in your street, they'll put a battery behind the substation, and the network will use that battery as a balancer, and you would get paid for discharging into that battery.
And does a battery provide the same sort of service as a gas or a hydro plant in the short term? Can it do that?
In the short term it can, but of course not for days on end.
No. Good. Next question's from Grenier. Why have we not already changed the times of off-peak and peak to peak supply periods? So why haven't we got off-peak in the middle of the day? No.
Well, we have in those places. My understanding is that in Adelaide, the distribution company has asked customers to do that, and it has happened. And I suspect it's probably happened in Perth too. They're not in the NEM, so I haven't, I've been watching some of the things they're doing, but they've been having similar issues, so I suspect they're probably doing that too.
And then
the other thing we can do in a connected system is that Tassie has a winter peak, which the rest of us don't. We all have summer peaks, and having more transmission allows us to just balance the system across different peaks and different time zones.
So would that be a reason for bringing forward the Marinus link and putting it as a higher priority one?
I think the thing that will bring it forward, Rob, is the amount of renewables coming into the system. And at the moment, we're running on the step change scenario in the integrated system plan, which is basically the highest scenario for renewables. And that's got Marinus coming in the I think the late 2020s from memory, rather than the mid-30s. So my expectation is that Marinus will be entering early because it's needed for renewables.
Yeah, I could imagine it might even be required earlier than that, the way so much renewables is going into the system.
Yes, it could be. We'll have Snowy 2 in before Marinus is available, so that will take, you know, most of the problem away for a while.
And Snowy 2 is well underway, and
that's my understanding. The tunnelling is underway, and I know the transmission is going through planning processes, which take a long time.
David asks, what do you think will be the time frame of hydrogen energy?
That's a question for Alan Finkel. Alan points to the gas industry and LPG and the development of that as a big export industry, and on that sort of time frame he says, you know, 15 years, but there's a lot of interest in it, particularly from Asia, and a lot of Japanese and Korean money going into its development. So it may be sooner, and it depends how it gets used, whether it's used as a supplement in the existing gas or whether it's used as pure hydrogen. So I think, you know, probably by the end of the decade.
That's quite soon then, yeah.
Mm.
And presumably progressively you could do the hydrogen into the gas system quite easily, up to 10% or something.
That's my understanding, and there are trials going on in Japan and the US with heavy vehicles running on hydrogen. So those sorts of things are happening now.
And from Selden, you talk about the system. What about breaking it up into smaller and more manageable parts, like microgrids?
Yeah, that's occurring too, and it's been particularly spurred on by the dreadful fires last summer, and some of the distribution companies in New South Wales and Victoria are finding, rather than putting very long skinny links back in, they can provide power more reliably to communities by putting in microgrids. And the Western Australians have got quite good experience at doing this also. But it is happening, and it's basically being driven just by the economics of whether it's cheaper to put in solar, wind and batteries compared to a very long, skinny piece of distribution network, basically.
But is there battles between the companies? Because is the company which is currently supplying the power or distributing it or retailing it different to one who will be running a microgrid?
Sometimes there are rules around this, so that the community being served has to be offered power that's as reliable and meets the standards that the current system does. But I think it's an area where the regulator probably needs to be some of the things that slow us down with the change are old regulations that are put in place for an old market that we're moving away from. So I would imagine that going forward, there'll probably be more opportunities for companies that aren't the distribution company to actually provide that service. At the moment, I'd suspect the regulator is probably a bit of a barrier to that happening.
Is that because the people who are on the regulating board, are they biased towards the industry or current industry?
No, there's nothing nefarious about it. It's just that there is a rule that the same standards have to apply, and sometimes it's difficult for a new entrant to get up to speed with that, but it's also I think just the regulator keeping up with the changes, and they're very aware of the need to change and be fit for the purpose now.
So does the Energy Security Board make suggestions to the regulator, or does the AMO do that, or how does that linkage work between the different groups?
No, we make suggestions, and they make suggestions to us too, because the Energy Security Board is made up of two independents, myself and David Swift, who's a South Australian that some of you may know, and then it's made up of the head of the AEMC, AEMO, and the AER, and we meet regularly. I would speak to all of those people, if not daily, certainly weekly, and we meet. At the moment, we seem to have been meeting for a couple of hours every week, but we meet regularly, so there's frequent exchange about things that are working and not working and need attention.
Good. You mentioned coal, but what about gas? What role will it play, and should it play?
Look, I think gas is important for the transition, and in electricity, I think its role will be reasonably temporary until we get more hydro and pumped hydro into the system, and until we get more hydrogen, and until the other thing that's driving it is the cost of batteries and storage, and the cost of batteries is falling rapidly in the same way that the cost of solar panels did. So while that's happening, it's getting harder and harder for gas, but at the moment we don't have a lot of options apart from gas in that transition period. But I would think by the time we're into our mid-30s, there won't be a need for much gas, but it really depends on technology changes and cost.
So why would anybody invest in a new gas plant if it's only got a 5-10 year life?
Well, I think it's probably got, well, at the moment, investing in a gas plant is actually quite difficult, and commercially. You do make a lot of money, but you're not sure when, and you're not sure how long you'll make it, because you would tend to turn the gas plant on only when there's not wind or solar or pumped hydro there. So it gets, when you need it, you really need it, and the spot price will be very high. but it's, you know, increasingly going to be a relatively small amount of time.
That's a hard calculation to make. Somebody investing quite a lot of money. Yeah.
Very uncomfortable for boards to spend a large sum of money with that equation in front of them.
So is that why the government is considering giving support for that, or?
I don't know, Rob. I think the gas-led recovery is largely aimed at manufacturing rather than electricity. And what happens with gas in electricity really depends a lot on the relative prices of gas and other alternatives.
Right, yeah. Arno asks, what do you see the role of demand management will be in the future energy market? Why has it not been pursued as much so far? It appears to be one of the cheapest options to reduce demand.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And one of the major initiatives we've been working on is demand response, and ensuring that people who are able, and businesses too, who are able to adjust their demand, get rewarded for doing so. And I think there could be, it could meet as high as 20% of the market. I think it'll take us a while to get there, but it's there are some business users and some residential where we can have a good demand response. And if you look at data centres, and which are becoming increasingly common and important, and warehouses which are running at certain temperatures and light conditions and so on, and refrigeration, all of those things need to be at particular ranges, but they don't need power all the time to do that. So there is certainly need for it. And it's also the fact that with steel and aluminium and things that we think of as terribly energy intensive, they are looking at processes to allow them to run their plants more flexibly. And that's so that they can run their plants more with renewable energy and also manage their load much better. So you're right, it's a huge thing. And one of the major initiatives we're working on with the new market design is demand response. So
if an aluminium smelter, say in Victoria, is about 20% of Victoria's load, I think.
Yeah.
So how do you have to change all your pricing rules to build that in to make it worthwhile? And
no, you don't need to change your pricing rules. You just need to make sure that if they take one megawatt of power, they pay for it, and then if they don't take 1 megawatt of power from their normal load, they should get paid roughly the same amount. But the problem for aluminium smelters in Australia at the moment is that they're not, they haven't been adjusted to be able to run more flexibly, and there are examples overseas where that sort of adjustment is made. And I think the steel plant in Whyalla that Mr. Gupta bought, the Arium plant, they're planning on running on as much solar as they can, and looking at flexible rolling mills and the like. So it just takes time for big manufacturers like that to change their plant and do these things.
But you don't have to make any major structural change to the pricing system. That will
not to the pricing system, but you have to allow demand response to be bid into the market. And at the moment, large energy loads have got that capacity and do that in the wholesale market and can do. But aggregated residential and small business loads don't have that opportunity. And that will change going forward.
Right. Another question is there an alternative to synchronous firming of the grid? It seems to be a bit of a hangover from the coal age.
No, it's not to do with coal, it's to do with how you keep, it's the physics of electricity really. You've got to keep it within a frequency and voltage range, and you need enough strength in your electricity that it can ride through minor perturbations. So if there's a lightning strike, for example, you don't want your whole system coming down, you want it to be able to ride through something like that. And that's what it's all about. And the coal and gas plants bring that strength because they've got big, large, metallic moving bits of equipment, really, which solar doesn't at all, and wind does a little bit, and hydro, of course, with the turbines that it's got, brings strength. So the easiest way of thinking about it is having some rather large ongoing thing that's not going to get upset by a perturbation.
And could a battery do that? Because it can respond very quickly.
A battery can do that for a very short period of time, for a little while, half an hour sort of time.
But that probably gets you over a lot of the problems, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It does. And the big battery in South Australia at Hornsdale has been providing frequency control services since it was put in.
And very profitably too, I believe.
So I understand, yeah.
MacBook Air again, why is the system so clumsy? My question about centralized control is about the profit motive versus the social need. What is your view?
I don't think the system is clumsy. I think it's actually quite delicate, and I think AEMO, who controls the system, certainly is a not-for-profit industry and government-owned system. So, yeah, I'm not sure how else to answer that question. I really don't. The way that I may have described it is clumsy, but it's actually a very sophisticated system.
Right. From Michael, is the NEM going to allow local generation and consumption without HV transmission charges and marginal loss factors?
Sorry, can you read that question again?
So, is the NEM going to allow local generation and consumption without HV transmission charges and marginal loss factors? So this is people generating locally and using the power locally and not using the grid.
Yeah, if you're a microgrid, you certainly don't pay for, transmission, high voltage transmission charges, and even in renewable energy zones where large amounts of wind and solar will go in and connect into the grid, localities in that area should be able to connect locally and get provided with power and basically get some benefit from it. And we've just been looking at planning arrangements for renewable energy zones, so it's something that people are thinking about.
Well, I hadn't heard of that one before. So if you're in a local renewable zone, the potential is you'll get cheaper power.
You might, because there's no particular reason why a distribution company that's in that area, or a microgrid, for example, can't get power that's cheaper. But it's something that we're just looking at the moment, and partly driven by the fact that we think if you're a community in the middle of a renewable energy zone, there's no particular reason why you shouldn't get some benefit from being closer to everything. But it at the moment, generators just connect into the grid and basically take their chances on being not congested. And the grid is not built to be free of congestion. It would be inefficient to build one that was free of congestion. So the marginal loss factors arise because of congestion. So one of the ways that we've been looking at dealing with that is through more localised pricing, and that's a really big change. And at the moment, industry can see that there's a need to eventually move in that direction, but at the moment everybody's very hesitant about making that very significant change too quickly.
Yeah, I can see that being a great opportunity for some rural areas
yes.
to have data centres and big
yes.
computer sets, which are
That's
very
right.
easy to relocate, I would have thought.
That's right.
That's quite an interesting development.
Well, there's nothing stopping you now putting in a big solar panel, big solar farm and running a data centre off it and never connecting to the grid really, or just for some part of the time. But yes, localised pricing I think could be very beneficial for both communities, but also send signals to people about where's not congested and where is congested.
Do you expect the delay in approval of priority transmission upgrades to be overcome soon?
Oh, no, I think there's two. It's always going to take a long time because putting in transmission lines, nobody wants a transmission line in their backyard or even anywhere near it. And nobody's terribly keen on putting them in national parks either. So I think these approval processes for environmental reasons and community reasons are always going to be slow, and it's important that we spend time trying to make sure that we minimise the impact on both the environment and people and communities.
And the economics of putting it underground are presumably just not worthwhile.
That's extremely prohibitive, yeah. Very, very expensive.
Right. And a sort of related question, I suppose, is are we considering adoption of long-distance HVDC to make interlinks easier to manage and transmission more efficient?
Yeah, we've looked at, we've had a bit of a look at DC, and I know that AEMO has looked at it. With our system being AC, if you put DC links in, you've then got to put in big inverters effectively at the end of each of your DC links. So if you were going to connect Perth with Adelaide, you'd probably put a DC in with inverters, but otherwise you don't really gain that much from going DC. So for very long distances, it's an economic question more than any other, I think.
So something like Townsville to Mount Isa or down the backbone of Queensland is distance is probably
but that's right. But then every time you have some line connecting off it, it would need to change to AC at some point so that it can be used within the system.
Yeah. And across to Tassie, Marinus, would that be DC?
I don't know, Rob. I'm not an expert on that. The Basslink could be DC now, for all I know, and then be converted where it comes to shore. I don't know, and links in.
From Peter, why is it so quiet on the solar concentrator malted salt front? Surely it's viable means of supplying sudden supply demands and compensating for reduced solar and wind.
I'm not sure about that technology. I don't know, to be honest.
Is existing gas-powered supply sufficient to cover our future needs? I'm presuming this means electricity side.
I think the answer is probably no for a little while. I think AGL are expanding in South Australia a little bit, and Energy Australia were looking at expanding their plant in the Illawarra in New South Wales. But all of that is to deal with really the amount of renewables coming in. So they won't run all the time, but they will run at particular times when there's no solar or there's a wind drought or, you know, as backup basically. And we don't have the battery technology to do that all the time, and we don't have the pumped hydro either yet.
So Snowy is a step change in that, though, isn't it?
Yes, yes, it is.
And if the coal generators are close to break even or making losses, could they suddenly all fall over and go bankrupt? Or
they could do. It is with the amount of renewables due to come in, it is very likely that the coal plants will retire much earlier than their technical life, and it will be the black coal plants in New South Wales in particular, and Yallourn, and also in Queensland, several plants up there. Queensland's got quite young plants that are quite efficient, but in New South Wales now, some of the coal plants are not running at full capacity and really cycling around the units to basically run as efficiently as they can. So they really will. The decarbonisation is partly being driven by all the renewables coming in, which are sending the coal plants broke. That's really what's happening.
Can we manage that so we lose them in a planned manner rather than let the market randomly do it?
Well, that's what we're trying to do through some of our mechanisms to make sure that we've got the right mix of fuel, the right mix of dispatchable power, basically, which means more batteries, more pumped hydro, and more gas until such time as hydrogen comes along.
What was the distinction you made between manufacturing and electricity? So I think this was probably for gas.
Yeah, it was for gas. The gas recovery plan that the Commonwealth Government have put out assumes gas at a relatively lower price than what the integrated system plan assumes. So I mean, the short answer is nobody knows what the price of gas is, but some manufacturing processes really depend on gas, like making fertilizer, and some others depend on it as a feedstock. So that's all. It's not. There's no other reason for it. Gas will be used depending on its price, frankly.
Yeah, and I think the price has been down sort of around the $4 a gigajoule, hasn't it, or less than the imported.
Yes, it's partly come down because of COVID, actually, and the economy being quite dampened, but it's not anticipated that it will stay down, and the supply on the East Coast is quite tight and tightening, I understand.
All right. Grenier asks, is there an issue using EV batteries' large potential demand to smooth generation if we rely on distribution network capacity?
No problem at all. Very good. And what we need to do is make sure we've got sufficient chargers that allow EV people to not only take power out, but also put power back in.
So is that permissible at the moment?
At the moment, I don't think that chargers are being put in like that, but in some countries, a certain amount of chargers have to be, both-way chargers for exactly that reason.
And then controlled remotely, or you have the option as the owner?
You as the owner have the option. If you need to charge up, you charge up, but if you get a little message on your phone saying that the electricity price is above something or other, you can go and plug it in and decharge and make some money.
So is that happening in Norway or somewhere like that? It's
happening in some countries in Europe, yes.
And we have the provision to do that?
There's no reason why we wouldn't. We really don't have the amount of EVs or chargers yet to be there, but we really do need to get in front of the EV technology so that, each state has the same sort of chargers and that a certain amount of them allow flows both ways.
From Arno, how do you see electricity replacing other forms of energy impact on the energy market? For example, electric cars displacing petrol and diesel, green hydrogen replacing methane.
Yeah.
In the chemical industry, electric heat pumps.
I think all of those things will happen, and I think industry is electrifying, so transport will become and is becoming more electric. Public transport as well as private vehicles, and industry is becoming more electrified and moving away from other forms, and it's because it's greener, so it's incumbent on us to make sure that we get the electricity sector decarbonised as fast as we can, because it'll help other sectors that find it much harder to decarbonise.
And does that change how you plan the grid? So is the demand going to be in quite different areas, or?
No, I don't think so, but it gets to the flexibility of demand that we've been talking about. We do need to make sure we've got flexible demand as far as possible.
From MacBook Air, the argument about benefits for people living next to generation doesn't make sense historically. The Trove Valley people didn't get cheaper power.
No, they didn't. They don't, and everybody pays the same network charge wherever you are. That's the way that gets to the point about the regulation and pricing at the moment is made for a system that we're moving away from very quickly to something else. So the regulator is very aware of the changes that are coming. You can't do everything at once.
And it's probably a couple of years to make any major change to it, at least to get through.
Certainly to the pricing on the distribution network, yeah.
This is maybe a related question. How would the localized pricing work for community renewables?
Yes, we're still working on this. It's early days.
How do you see the development of a large renewable hydrogen export industry, say to Japan or Korea and possibly Europe, impact on the energy market? How do we make sure electricity is available for the local market and we avoid the current situation in the gas market?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? Yes, exactly. The aim of the green hydrogen thing, I think, and building it into an export market, that's sort of the dream at the moment, really. It's a fair way off, but I mean, point well taken. We mustn't ever get into the situation, really, that we've got into with gas. But the gas situation is partly caused by our decisions about limiting supply through not fracking and so on, which is a perfectly reasonable decision to make, but it did mean that the governments weren't really thinking about supply. And ironically, the only government that did think about it was Western Australia, who insisted on pipelines to Perth and insisted on a reasonable price for domestic use.
All right. So we're coming near to the end of time and also near to the end of the questions.
That's good.
You talked about 50% by 2030 and then going to 70%.
Yeah.
I'm surprised. Well, is it so much more difficult to go from 70 to 90 and then from 90 to 100? Isn't it just a case of more batteries and more pumped hydro and the like?
Yes, it is, but it takes we're a very dry continent, so pumped hydro options are not readily available, and I think we will develop the more obvious ones of those, but I'm not a physicist, but the AEMO and their system physics people tell me that once you get over 75 or 80, it's quite difficult to run the system. You can run it at 100% some days and weeks, but throughout a whole year to run at that level is very difficult. And we'll learn a bit from what Tasmania are up to, because they are running at 100, but they're doing so net, and they're importing, some days they're importing a lot of power from Victoria, which is effectively brown coal. So they see a need to do that. So I'm not sure about the technology limitations at the moment, but I'm told that they're there, and I don't know enough physics to be able to argue against it.
Mm.
But if we get to 70, certainly better than where we are.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Mm. And the Energy Security Board, what's its future?
Oh, well, we
and
were...
the other organisations too.
Yeah, we were put in place... We were put in place following the Finkel review for 3 years, and then we were given the job of redesigning the market, which will take us another 12 months. At roundabout, we've recently been reviewed, and in roundabout June, the energy ministers of the NEM will need to make a decision on what they want to do with the Energy Security Board. Our main role, once we've finished this design work, is really to make sure that the three market bodies work well and coordinate together and keep in touch with each other, particularly about policy things. And the market bodies do that much better now than they did 3 years ago. But it's quite helpful, I think, having a couple of independent people there to just basically get everybody together and make sure that things are moving forward. So I think some sort of forum for policy is needed like that, and implementation. So it'll be up to ministers. We'll see what they want to do.
And it's that even more so when you have a federal government which has got quite a different view to probably all the states. So you have to somehow balance those.
Yes, yes. It's interesting because the states have very common views on decarbonisation and targets, which is really what's driving all the change in the market. So I'm sure that will continue. So it will, yeah.
And if the Fed's changed, would that make a dramatic difference?
If everybody was on the same page, it would make it easier to coordinate the trajectories. But all the states are in the same place, so it's not as difficult as it could be.
So we had an overall board which has everybody on, the state ministers and the federal ministers. So really they are doing their own thing, whatever the federal minister is saying. They're overruling him effectively. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But we don't end up with 6 different systems, but at least they're talking to each other a reasonable amount.
They are talking to each other, and the policies that they're taking are slightly different from state to state. And one of the things we'll try to do with the market design is get something in place that they can all use. So if we do keep the national system together, because it is much more efficient and least cost for consumers.
Yeah. There's one sort of little technical question come up on, doesn't pumped hydro recirculate all the water, so you actually can go through droughts quite well because you're reusing the same water?
You can, but you still get some water loss through just evaporation and the use of it. But yes, you can.
Yep. Good, great. Well,
thank you very much, everybody.
Do you want to add anything else?
No, thank you. No, thank you.
Rightio. Just before I do a formal thanks, just like to say that Renew Melbourne branch is keen to keep offering these webinars during this position of going through a period of transition at Renew, really. The AGM is on this Thursday, so please log into that and vote. And if you want somebody to be a proxy, you have to have your proxies organised by 6 p.m. tomorrow. We're going to put up a brief poll at the end, so we'd appreciate it if you could complete it before leaving. Now, I found that an excellent evening. Thank you very much, Kerry. Such good analysis and so many questions, huge number of questions. So thank you very much. It was very, very informative.
Well, thanks, everyone. We're really going through a huge amount of change and disruption, but we're getting there.
Yep. And I always find the ending of these Zoom meetings very disappointing, that there's 100 people clapping and you can't hear any of them.
Hit the leave button. Yes, there you go.
So thank you again. It was great.